Wellington stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, watching the city sprawl beneath him like a chess board where he controlled most of the pieces. At 42, he had built an empire from nothing, turning a small tech startup into a multinational corporation worth billions. His reflection stared back at him from the glass-sharp suit, perfectly styled dark hair with hints of premature silver, and eyes that had grown cold from years of ruthless business decisions. The intercom buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. "Mr. Wellington, your driver is waiting downstairs," his assistant announced. Glanced at his platinum watch. 6:30 in the evening. Most fathers would be rushing home to dinner with their families, but for going home meant facing a reality he had been avoiding for months. His 3 daughters, Emma, Sophie, and little Lily, each diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, each struggling in ways he felt helpless to address. The ride to his Malibu mansion was silent except for the gentle hum of the luxury sedan's engine. Scrolled through emails on his phone, finding comfort in the familiar world of profit margins and market projections. Anything to avoid thinking about the challenges waiting for him at home. The Wellington estate sprawled across 5 acres of perfectly manicured grounds, with a main house that looked more like a modern art museum than a family home. As the car pulled into the circular driveway, noticed something unusual. The lights were on in the sunroom, and he could hear something he rarely heard anymore, the sound of his daughters laughing. He dismissed his driver and walked quietly toward the front entrance, but curiosity drew him toward the sunroom instead. Through the large windows, he saw a scene that stopped him in his tracks. A young black woman sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by his 3 daughters. She couldn't have been more than 28, with natural hair pulled back in a colorful headband and wearing simple jeans and a bright yellow sweater. What struck most was not her appearance, but the way his daughters were responding to her. 8-year-old Emma, who usually spent her evenings rocking back and forth while staring at the wall, was actually making eye contact with this woman. 6-year-old Sophie, who had violent meltdowns whenever anyone touched her, was allowing the woman to gently brush her long hair. And 4-year-old Lily, who had never spoken a word in her life, was making soft, humming sounds while playing with colorful blocks the woman had arranged in front of her. Found himself frozen, watching through the window like a stranger observing his own family. The woman was speaking to them in a soft, melodic voice. "Emma, can you show me what color this block is?" she asked, holding up a bright red cube. Emma looked directly at her, something she rarely did with anyone. "Red," she said clearly, a small smile tugging at her lips. "That's right, beautiful girl. You're so smart." The woman's praise was genuine, not the forced enthusiasm had heard from the parade of expensive therapists and specialists he had hired. Sophie looked up from having her hair brushed. "Miss Grace, will you sing the butterfly song again?" Miss Grace, so that was her name. Realized with a start that he hadn't even known the name of the woman who had been caring for his daughters for the past 3 weeks. He had left all the hearing decisions to his household manager, Mrs., too busy with a major acquisition to pay attention to domestic matters. Grace began to sing a gentle song about butterflies, using hand gestures that the girls tried to copy. Her voice was beautiful, rich, and warm. Even from outside, could feel the peace that seemed to radiate from this simple moment. "Butterfly, butterfly, dance in the sky, spread your wings and learn to fly," Grace sang, and all 3 girls attempted to mimic her movements, flapping their arms like wings. Had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on the best specialists money could buy. He had hired behavioral therapists, occupational therapists, speech therapists, and developmental specialists. The girls' schedules were packed with appointments and interventions, all designed to fix them according to the latest research and methodologies. Yet here was this young woman, probably making a fraction of what those specialists charged, achieving something had never seen before. His daughters looked happy, not just content or calm, but genuinely joyful. The sliding door to the sunroom opened, and Mrs. appeared. "Girls, it's time for dinner," she announced in her usual brisk manner. Watched as Grace immediately shifted gears. "Okay, my loves, let's clean up our toys first. Emma, can you help me put the blocks in the blue box? Sophie, will you help me fold this blanket?" Instead of the usual resistance and meltdowns that accompanied transitions, the girls actually began helping. Grace made it feel like a game, counting the blocks as they put them away and praising each small contribution. "Lily found a yellow block," Grace exclaimed as the youngest girl held up a cube. You found yellow, sweet girl. Lily beamed and carefully placed the block in the box, then looked up at Grace expectantly. What do we say when we finish cleaning? Grace prompted gently. All done, Sophie and Emma said together, and Lily clapped her hands. Felt something strange happening in his chest, a tightness he hadn't experienced in years. When was the last time he had seen his daughters respond to anyone with such trust and affection? He quickly stepped back from the window and walked around to the main entrance, timing his arrival to seem natural. As he entered the foyer, he could hear the girls chattering as they made their way to the dining room. Daddy, Emma called out when she saw him, something she rarely did. She actually ran to him, though she stopped just short of physical contact. Miss Grace taught us about butterflies. Knelt down to Emma's level, surprised by her enthusiasm. Did she? That sounds wonderful. Sophie approached more cautiously, but she was smiling. She has a pretty voice, Daddy. She sings songs. Even little Lily toddled over, looking between her sisters and her father with bright eyes. Girls, let your father get settled, Mrs. said, but Grace appeared in the doorway, gently shaking her head. It's all right, Grace said softly. They're excited to share their day. She looked at for the first time, and he was struck by her direct gaze. Most of his employees avoided eye contact, intimidated by his reputation and wealth. But Grace looked at him as if he were simply another parent, nothing more or less. Mr. Wellington, she said with a slight nod. I hope you don't mind that we moved our activities to the sunroom. The natural light seemed to help the girls focus better. Found himself at a loss for words. When was the last time someone in his household had made a decision based on what would help his daughters rather than what would be most convenient or impressive? That's fine, he managed. I could hear them laughing from outside. Grace smiled and her whole face lit up. They're wonderful girls. Each one has such a unique personality and special gifts. Gifts, not challenges or disorders or problems to be solved. Gifts. During dinner, found himself observing his daughters more closely than he had in months. Grace sat with them, cutting Lily's food into small pieces and gently reminding Sophie to try her vegetables. When Emma began to rock slightly in her chair, a self-soothing behavior that usually escalated into distress, Grace quietly moved her own chair closer and began humming softly. Emma's rocking gradually slowed and stopped. She looked at Grace and smiled. She likes music, Grace explained too. It seems to help regulate her emotions. Nodded, though he realized he hadn't known this about his own daughter. How did you figure that out? I pay attention, Grace said simply. Every child tells you what they need if you know how to listen. After dinner, retreated to his study as usual, but he found it difficult to concentrate on the stack of contracts waiting for his review. He kept thinking about what he had witnessed. His daughters had never responded to anyone the way they responded to Grace. Around 8 o'clock, he heard Grace reading bedtime stories. Her voice carried down the hallway, animated and engaging. Curious, he quietly walked toward the girls' bedrooms. Grace was sitting on the floor between Emma and Sophie's beds, while Lily was curled up in a small chair with a stuffed elephant. She was reading Where the Wild Things Are, but she was making each monster voice different, acting out the story with such enthusiasm that all three girls were completely captivated. And Max said, "Let the wild rumpus start," Grace roared in a silly monster voice, making clawing gestures. All three girls giggled, actual, genuine giggles. Couldn't remember the last time he had heard them laugh like that. When the story ended, Grace helped each girl settle into bed. She had somehow learned each of their specific needs. Emma liked her blanket folded in a particular way. Sophie needed her stuffed animals arranged just so, and Lily required a gentle back rub to fall asleep. "Sweet dreams, my beautiful girls," Grace whispered as she dimmed the lights. "Tomorrow we'll have new adventures." Stepped back into the shadows as Grace left the room, not wanting to be caught spying on this intimate bedtime routine. But as she passed him in the hallway, she paused. "They're really remarkable children, Mr. Wellington," she said softly. "I hope you know that." Before he could respond, she had continued down the hallway toward the staff quarters. Stood in the dim hallway for a long time, listening to the quiet sounds of his daughters settling into sleep. No crying, no meltdowns, no hours of anxiety and resistance, just peace. For the first time in years, found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about his daughters and their needs. He had approached their autism like a business problem to be solved. throwing money and resources at it without ever truly understanding what his children were experiencing. But Grace seemed to see something in them that everyone else had missed. She saw them not as broken things to be fixed, but as whole human beings with their own unique ways of experiencing the world. As he finally made his way to his own bedroom, made a decision. Tomorrow, instead of leaving for the office at dawn as usual, he would stay home for a while. He wanted to observe more of these interactions. He needed to understand what Grace was doing differently, and more importantly, he needed to understand his own daughters better. For the first time since his wife Diana had died 2 years ago, leaving him to raise 3 special needs children on his own, felt a glimmer of something he had almost forgotten existed: hope. He fell asleep that night to the sound of silence from his daughter's rooms. Not the heavy silence of distress or withdrawal, but the peaceful quiet of children who felt safe and loved. The next morning, made the unprecedented decision to work from home. He set up his laptop in the kitchen, positioning himself where he could observe the morning routine without being intrusive. Grace arrived at 7:30, as she apparently did every morning. She greeted each girl individually, kneeling down to their level and making eye contact. "Good morning, Emma. I love your pajamas. Dinosaurs are so cool." "Good morning, Sophie. Your hair looks beautiful this morning. Did you brush it all by yourself?" "Good morning, sweet Lily. Are you ready for breakfast, love?" Each greeting was tailored to the individual child, acknowledging something specific about them. It was such a small thing, but realized that most people, including himself, tended to address his daughters as a group, not as individuals. Breakfast was a revelation. Grace had somehow learned each girl's preferences and sensitivities. Emma's food was separated on her plate so different items didn't touch. Sophie's milk was in a blue cup because, apparently, she wouldn't drink from any other color. Lily's banana was cut into perfect circles, not slices. "How did you learn all their preferences?" asked, genuinely curious. Grace looked up from helping Lily with her spoon. "I asked Mrs. some questions, but mostly I just watched. Children show you what they need if you pay attention to the small things." "The small things?" "Like how Emma gets upset when her food touches, or how Sophie only likes to eat with a small fork, or how Lily needs her fruit cut in shapes, not slices. These aren't difficult accommodations, they just require noticing." Felt a familiar pang of guilt. He hadn't noticed any of these things. His morning routine had always been to grab coffee and leave for the office while Mrs. handled breakfast. After breakfast, Grace suggested they spend time in the garden. "Fresh air and nature can be so calming for sensitive children," she explained. Watched from his study window as Grace led his daughters outside. She had brought a collection of bubbles, and she began blowing them across the garden. Emma, who usually avoided outdoor activities, was actually chasing the bubbles and trying to pop them. Sophie was spinning in circles, trying to catch them on her fingers, and Lily was clapping with delight each time a bubble drifted near her. It was such a simple activity, yet it seemed to bring all 3 girls pure joy. Around mid-morning, his phone rang. It was his assistant, reminding him about an important meeting he was supposed to attend downtown. "Reschedule it," said without hesitation. "Sir, this is the industry's meeting you've been preparing for all month." "I said reschedule it. Something more important has come up." After he hung up, realized he couldn't remember the last time he had called anything more important than a business meeting. But watching his daughters laugh and play in the sunshine felt more valuable than any deal he had ever made. Grace had a remarkable way of turning every moment into a learning opportunity without making it feel like work or therapy. When the girls found a ladybug on a flower, Grace helped them observe it closely, talking about its spots and how it helped the garden. When Sophie had a brief meltdown because a bubble popped before she could catch it, Grace didn't try to distract her or rush her through the emotions. Instead, she sat with her, acknowledging her disappointment and helping her breathe through it. "It's okay to feel sad when something doesn't work the way we wanted," Grace said gently, rubbing Sophie's back. "Sometimes bubbles pop before we can catch them, but look, we can make more." Sophie's tears dried as she watched Grace blow a new stream of bubbles, and soon she was laughing again. Found himself taking notes on his laptop, not for any business purpose, but simply to remember these techniques. He was learning more about effective parenting in one morning than he had in all the expensive consultations he had paid for. As lunchtime approached, Grace began the transition preparation that seemed to be key to her success with the girls. "In 5 minutes, we're going to go inside for lunch," she announced. "Let's count down together. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, time to go inside." The girls followed her willingly. No resistance or anxiety about the change in activity. During lunch, decided to join them at the table instead of eating in his study as usual. The conversation was different from what he expected. Grace didn't talk down to the children or oversimplify her language. She spoke to them about real things, the flowers they had seen in the garden, a story she had read about butterflies, plans for the afternoon. "Mr. Wellington," Emma said suddenly, looking directly at him. "Miss Grace says you work with computers and numbers. Do you like numbers?" Was so surprised by the direct question that he almost choked on his sandwich. Emma rarely initiated conversation with anyone. "Yes, I do like numbers," he said carefully. "Do you like numbers too?" Emma nodded enthusiastically. "I can count to 100, want to hear?" Before he could answer, Emma began counting, her voice clear and confident. She made it all the way to 100 without a single mistake. "That's incredible," Emma said, and he meant it. "I'm very impressed." Emma beamed and felt that strange tightness in his chest again. After lunch, Grace announced it was quiet time. Instead of sending the girls to their rooms alone, she created a peaceful environment in the living room with soft music, dimmed lights, and comfortable pillows. Each girl had a different quiet activity. Emma had a number puzzle, Sophie had a coloring book, and Lily had soft, sensory toys. Grace settled into a corner with a book, but noticed she was constantly aware of each child's needs. When Emma finished her puzzle and looked uncertain about what to do next, Grace quietly handed her another one. When Sophie's crayon broke and she began to look distressed, Grace immediately provided a new one. When Lily started to get sleepy, Grace gently helped her lie down with a soft blanket. The house was peaceful in a way had never experienced. No crying, no chaos, no stress. Just calm, content children and a young woman who seemed to understand them better than anyone else ever had. As the afternoon wore on, found himself wondering about Grace's background. How had she learned to connect with children like this? Where had she come from? What was her story? But more than that, he found himself wondering what his life could be like if every day was like this one. For the first time since his wife's death, began to imagine a future where his daughters were truly thriving, where his home was filled with laughter instead of silence, where being a father felt like a joy instead of an overwhelming responsibility. The transformation he was witnessing wasn't just in his daughters. Something was changing in him too, though he wasn't quite ready to examine what that meant. As evening approached and Grace began preparing for the end of her work the next morning, made another unprecedented decision. Instead of his usual ritual of scanning stock reports over coffee, he found himself in the kitchen at 7:15, waiting for Grace to arrive. He had questions that had kept him awake most of the night, questions about methods and background, but mostly questions about how someone so young could possess such wisdom about children. When Grace walked through the kitchen door at exactly 7:30, she seemed surprised to find him there. "Good morning, Mr. Wellington," she said, setting down a colorful tote bag that appeared to be filled with books and small toys. "You're up early today." "I wanted to talk with you," said, then immediately felt awkward. When was the last time he had wanted to have a conversation with someone that wasn't about business? About the girls, about what you're doing with them. Grace began pulling items from her bag, picture books, sensory toys, what looked like homemade with photographs. "Of course, what would you like to know?" Watched as she organized the materials with practiced efficiency. Everything seemed to have a purpose, a place in some larger plan he couldn't quite see. "Yesterday was different," he began. "I've never seen them respond to anyone the way they respond to you. I need to understand what you're doing so I can be a better father to them." Grace paused in her organizing and looked at him with those direct, honest eyes. "You want to learn about your own daughters?" There was no judgment in her tone, but felt the weight of the question anyway. "I realize I don't know them as well as I should. I've been focused on providing for them, getting them the best treatments, the best specialists. But I haven't been focused on understanding them." Grace nodded thoughtfully. "Understanding comes first, everything else builds from there." "So teach me," said simply. "I want to learn." Before Grace could respond, the sound of small feet on the stairs announced the girl's arrival. Emma came first, already dressed but with her shirt on backwards. Sophie followed, dragging her favorite blanket and looking sleepy. Lily brought up the rear, still in her pajamas and carrying her stuffed elephant. "Good morning, my beautiful girls," Grace called out, and watched the immediate brightening in all three faces. It was like watching flowers turn toward the sun. "Miss Grace," Sophie ran to her, and was amazed when Grace knelt down and Sophie actually allowed herself to be hugged. Physical affection was usually impossible for Sophie. "Emma, sweetheart, let's fix your shirt," Grace said gently. "Sometimes it's tricky to know which way is front and which way is back, isn't it?" Instead of being embarrassed, Emma giggled and lifted her arms so Grace could help her turn the shirt around. Realized Grace had addressed the issue without making Emma feel wrong or foolish. "Lily, love, should we go pick out some clothes for today after breakfast?" Grace suggested. Lily nodded and climbed onto Grace's lap as she sat down at the kitchen island. Found himself taking mental notes again. Grace greeted each child individually, addressed their immediate needs without making them feel inadequate, and somehow made each girl feel special and valued. As Grace began preparing breakfast, she kept up a steady stream of gentle conversation with the girls, but noticed she was also explaining things to him. "Emma loves routine and predictability," Grace said as she laid out Emma's breakfast with each item in its specific place. "But she also loves learning new things, so I try to introduce novelty within structure. Same breakfast setup, but maybe a new fact about dinosaurs or a new number game." She turned to Sophie's breakfast. "Sophie is very sensitive to textures and temperatures. She needs her food just warm, not hot, and she prefers smooth textures over chunky ones. But she's also incredibly creative, so after meals, we often do art projects or imaginative play." Finally, she prepared Lily's breakfast. Lily is our quiet observer. She takes in everything around her, even though she doesn't speak yet. She understands far more than people realize, and she communicates in her own ways. Watch her hands, she has signs for things she wants or needs. As if to demonstrate, Lily pointed to her cup and then tapped her lips. "She's saying she's thirsty," Grace translated. "Lily invented her own sign language, isn't that clever?" Was fascinated. "How did you learn all of this so quickly?" Grace smiled as she poured Lily's milk into the blue cup. "I spend time with them. Real time, not just supervision. I watch what makes them happy, what makes them anxious, what interests them. Every child is constantly telling you who they are, you just have to pay attention." During breakfast, Grace demonstrated her approach. When Emma began rocking slightly in her chair, instead of trying to stop the behavior, Grace began humming quietly. The rocking slowed and became more rhythmic, matching Grace's tune. "Rocking is self-regulation for Emma," Grace explained quietly too. "It's not a problem to solve, it's a tool she uses to feel calm. If I try to stop it, she becomes more anxious. If I work with it, we can use it to help her focus." When Sophie spilled a small amount of milk on the table, braced for a meltdown, spills usually triggered intense distress for Sophie. But Grace calmly handed her a small towel. "Spills happen," Grace said matter-of-factly. "Let's clean it up together." Sophie carefully wiped the spill, and that was it. No tears, no panic, no shame. "How did you know she wouldn't have a meltdown?" asked. "Because I've been consistent about treating spills as normal occurrences, not disasters," Grace explained. "The first few times, she did get upset, but when I stayed calm and matter-of-fact about it, she learned that spills aren't catastrophes. Children often mirror the emotional energy around them." After breakfast, Grace announced it was time for morning meeting. She led the girls to the sunroom, where she had arranged cushions in a circle on the floor. "Morning meeting is our chance to talk about the day ahead," she explained to who had followed to observe. "It gives them predictability and control." Each girl had a chance to share something. Emma talked about wanting to count to 150 today. Sophie mentioned she hoped to see a butterfly in the garden, and Lily pointed to a picture book and then to the window. "Lily wants to read a story outside," Grace translated. "That sounds perfect for later this morning." Grace then pulled out a simple visual schedule. She had created pictures showing the different activities they would do throughout the day. This helps them understand what's coming next. Uncertainty can be very stressful for children with autism. Found himself wondering why none of the expensive specialists had ever suggested something so simple yet effective. The morning activities were a revelation. Grace had clearly studied each girl's interests and learning style. For Emma, who loved numbers and patterns, she had created math games using colored blocks and simple equations. For Sophie, who was drawn to art and beauty, she set up a nature collage station with flowers and leaves they had collected from the garden. For Lily, who was fascinated by cause and effect, she provided a set of simple science experiments dropping objects in water, mixing colors, watching balls roll down ramps. But what impressed most was how Grace connected the activities. When Emma finished her math games, Grace showed her how to count the petals on Sophie's flowers. When Sophie completed her collage, Grace helped her describe the colors to Lily, who was experimenting with color mixing. "You're teaching them to include each other," observed. Grace smiled. Children with autism are often isolated, even from their siblings, but these girls love each other deeply. They just need help learning how to connect with each other in ways that work for their different needs. Around mid-morning, Mrs. appeared with a visitor, Dr. Sarah, the developmental pediatrician who had been working with the girls for 6 months. "Mr. Wellington," Doctor said, looking surprised to find him there. "I wasn't expecting to see you today. Are you taking time off?" "I'm observing," said simply. "I want to understand what's working for my daughters." Doctor looked around the sunroom, where the girls were peacefully engaged in their activities while Grace moved between them, offering gentle guidance and encouragement. "The atmosphere is certainly calmer than usual," Doctor admitted. "How are you achieving this level of cooperation?" Found himself protective of Grace's methods. Grace has developed a very individualized approach based on observation and understanding each child's specific needs. Doctor pulled out her tablet and began making notes. "I'd like to observe the therapeutic interventions you're implementing." Grace looked up from where she was helping Lily with her color experiment. "I'm not implementing therapeutic interventions. I'm just spending time with the children and responding to their individual needs." Doctor frowned. "But surely you're following some kind of behavioral modification protocol, applied behavior analysis, social skills training curriculum." "No," Grace said simply. "I'm just being present with them and accepting them as they are." Could see Doctor's confusion, and frankly, he understood it. He had been paying Doctor substantial fees for complex intervention strategies and detailed behavioral plans. Yet Grace's simple approach of acceptance and individual attention seemed to be achieving better results than all the formal protocols combined. "I'd like to speak with you privately, Mr. Wellington," Doctor said. They stepped into study, where Doctor closed the door and turned to face him with obvious concern. "I need to express some professional concerns about what I observed," she began. "This young woman has no apparent training in autism intervention. She's not implementing any evidence-based practices. The children may seem calmer now, but without proper behavioral interventions, you risk regression." Found himself bristling at the criticism. The children are happy, they're learning, they're connecting with each other and with Grace in ways they never have before. "But it's not sustainable," Doctor insisted. "What happens when she leaves? How will you maintain progress without proper therapeutic structure?" For the first time, the question of Grace's permanence hit squarely. What did happen when she left? This wasn't just about temporary babysitting. This was about his daughter's well-being and development. "I think," said carefully, "that I need to focus on what's actually working for my children, not what should work according to theory." Doctor gathered her things with obvious displeasure. "I hope you'll reconsider. These children need professional intervention, not just kindness." After she left, sat in his study for several minutes, processing the conversation. Was he making a mistake by valuing Grace's approach over professional expertise? But then he heard the sound of his daughters laughing from the sunroom, and he knew he had to trust what he was seeing with his own eyes. When he returned to the sunroom, he found Grace reading a story to the girls. She had each of them positioned where they could see the pictures, and she was using different voices for each character. All 3 girls were completely engaged, even Lily, who usually had difficulty focusing on stories. "Grace," said when the story ended, "could we talk privately?" He led her to the garden, where they could speak without being overheard. "Doctor had some concerns about your methods," began. Grace nodded, unsurprised. "I imagine she did. What I do doesn't fit into traditional therapeutic models." "Can you help me understand your background? Where did you learn to work with children like this?" Grace was quiet for a moment, looking out at the garden where they had played with bubbles the day before. I don't have formal training in autism therapy, if that's what you're asking. I have a bachelor's degree in early childhood development, but most of what I know came from my brother. Your brother's? My younger brother David is autistic. He's 25 now, but when he was little, my family couldn't afford all the specialists and therapies. My parents both worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. So I became David's primary caregiver after school and during summers. Felt a shift in his understanding. So you learned from experience. I learned from loving him, Grace corrected gently. I learned that all the theories in the world don't matter if you don't first accept and love the child exactly as they are. I learned that behavior is communication, that meltdowns are usually about overwhelm or unmet needs, that every child has gifts that might not look like what society expects. Grace paused, seeming to collect her thoughts. David didn't speak until he was 7. Specialists wanted to put him in special schools, said he'd never be independent. But I knew he was brilliant, he just experienced the world differently. Today, he's a computer programmer. He has his own apartment, pays his own bills, has friends. But that only happened because our family focused on understanding him and supporting him, not fixing him. Felt something clicking into place. That's what you're doing with my daughters, understanding and supporting them. Children with autism don't need to be cured or fixed, Grace said. They need to be understood, accepted, and given tools to navigate a world that isn't always designed for their needs. Your daughters are already perfect exactly as they are. My job is just to help them develop their own unique strengths and find ways to connect with the world around them. They walked back toward the house and found himself processing everything Grace had shared. Her approach wasn't based on textbooks or clinical studies. It was based on love and deep understanding earned through years of real-world experience. Grace, he said as they reached the patio, I want you to know that I value what you're doing here. More than value it, I think you're changing my daughters' lives, and mine. Grace smiled but caught a flicker of something in her expression. Uncertainty, sadness. Is everything all right? He asked. Grace hesitated. Mr. Wellington, I need to be honest with you. This position is temporary for me. I'm saving money to go back to school for my master's degree in special education. I've been accepted for the spring semester, which starts in 2 months. Felt the ground shift beneath him. 2 months. In 2 months, this remarkable young woman who had brought peace and joy to his home would be gone. Can't you defer? I could increase your salary, provide benefits. Grace shook her head gently. It's not about money. This is something I need to do. I want to become a special education teacher so I can help more children like David, like Emma and Sophie and Lily. Understood ambition, he had built his fortune on it. But the thought of losing Grace, of watching his daughters lose this connection they had found, felt devastating. How long have you known? He asked. I mentioned it to Mrs. when I interviewed, but I don't think she passed it along. I assumed you knew this was temporary. Realized that once again, his inattention to household details had left him. He had been so focused on business that he hadn't even known the basic terms of Grace's employment. That afternoon, as he watched Grace guide his daughters through art time, found himself looking at everything differently. Every moment felt precious, temporary. Every laugh from his daughters felt like something he needed to memorize before it disappeared. The girls were finger painting, something would have thought was too messy and chaotic for children with sensory sensitivities. But Grace had prepared carefully smocks to protect clothing, specific textures of paint that weren't overwhelming, and clear boundaries about where painting happened. Emma was creating patterns with red and blue paint, making precise geometric designs. Sophie was painting what looked like a garden full of flowers, and Lily was simply enjoying the sensation of the paint on her fingers, making swirls and handprints. Look, Daddy, Sophie called out, holding up her painting. It's our garden. Moved closer to see her work. She had painted the sunroom where they spent their mornings, with all 3 girls sitting in a circle with Grace. It was recognizable and beautiful, created by a 6-year-old who had found a way to express her happiness. It's wonderful, Sophie said and meant it. You're quite an artist. Sophie beamed and returned to her painting, adding more details to her happy scene. As watched his daughters create and laugh and learn, he realized that Grace hadn't just changed how his children experienced their days. She had changed how he saw his children, how he saw their future, how he saw his role as their father. But in 2 months, she would be gone. and had no idea how to preserve what she had the knowledge that Grace would be leaving in 2 months hung over like a storm cloud. But he was determined not to waste the time they had left. He began working from home more frequently, scheduling meetings around his daughter's routines, and declining business trips that would take him away from the house. His assistant was bewildered by the sudden changes. "Sir, the Shanghai conference is crucial for the Asian expansion," she protested during one of their morning calls. "Send Richardson," said, watching through his office window as Grace led his daughters in their morning circle time. "He can handle it." "But you've been planning this expansion for 2 years." Interrupted gently but firmly, "I have other priorities right now." After he hung up, realized how foreign those words felt in his mouth. For 20 years, business had been his only priority. Everything else, family, personal relationships, even his own health, had been secondary to building his empire. But something fundamental was shifting inside him, and he wasn't entirely sure what to do with the feeling. A soft knock on his study door interrupted his thoughts. Grace peered in, looking slightly uncertain. "I'm sorry to bother you, but Emma has been asking if you'd like to join us for math time. She wants to show you her counting games." Looked at his laptop screen, where urgent emails were piling up. 6 months ago, the choice would have been automatic. Work always came first, but Emma had asked for him specifically. His daughter wanted to share something with him. "I'll be right there," he said, closing the laptop. In the sunroom, Emma had arranged colorful blocks in complex patterns. When she saw her father, her face lit up with pride. "Daddy, look, I made addition pyramids." Emma pointed to her creation. 3 plus 2 equals 5, and 5 plus 3 equals 8, and 8 plus 2 equals 10. Knelt beside her, genuinely impressed by the mathematical thinking on display. "Emma, this is incredible. You understand addition sequences." Emma beamed and began building another pyramid. "Miss Grace says I have a mathematician's brain. Do you have a mathematician's brain too, Daddy?" The question caught off guard. When was the last time anyone had asked him about his own interests, his own passions? When was the last time he had even thought about what he enjoyed beyond the mechanics of business success? Yes, I think I do," he said slowly. "I love numbers and patterns too. Maybe we could work on math problems together sometime." Emma's response was immediate and enthusiastic. "Yes, Miss Grace, can Daddy do math time with us every day?" Grace smiled. "If your daddy would like to, that sounds wonderful." As they worked together on Emma's number games, felt something he hadn't experienced in years, pure joy in learning and discovery. Emma's enthusiasm was contagious. Her pride in her mathematical thinking was evident, and sharing this moment with her felt more valuable than any business achievement he could remember. Sophie approached shyly, carrying a book about flowers. "Daddy, would you like to see my flower book? Miss Grace helped me learn all the names." Moved to make room for Sophie beside him. She opened the book and began pointing to pictures, nomming each flower with careful pronunciation. "This is a petunia, and this is a marigold, and this one is my favorite. It's called a forget-me-not." "Why is it your favorite?" asked. Sophie thought for a moment. "Because the name means you always remember something beautiful. Miss Grace says that's what love is, remembering all the beautiful things about someone even when they're not with you." The simple wisdom from his 6-year-old daughter hit with unexpected force. When was the last time he had focused on the beautiful things about his children rather than their challenges? When was the last time he had focused on beautiful things about anyone? Lily toddled over with her sensory toys, settling herself against Leg with comfortable familiarity. She handed him a textured ball and pointed to her own identical toy, then began rolling it in slow, rhythmic motions. "She wants you to copy her movements," Grace explained softly. "It's her way of connecting and sharing an experience." Began rolling his ball in the same rhythm as Lily. She looked up at him with bright eyes and smiled, then changed the pattern. Followed her lead, and they continued this gentle, wordless game for several minutes. "I didn't know she could communicate like this," said quietly. "Lily communicates constantly," Grace said. "She just doesn't use words. She uses gestures, expressions, body language, shared activities. She's having a conversation with you right now, a conversation about rhythm and connection and being together." Looked down at his youngest daughter, this little person he had thought he didn't know how to reach. But here she was, reaching out to him in her own unique way, and it was beautiful. That afternoon, Grace suggested they spend time in the garden. She had prepared a new activity, helping the girls plant seeds in small pots that they could watch grow over time. Gardening teaches patience and care, she explained to as they gathered supplies. It also gives them something to nurture and be responsible for. Each girl chose different seeds. Emma selected sunflowers because she loved how tall they could grow. Sophie chose morning glories because she thought the name was beautiful. Lily was fascinated by the tiny marigold seeds and spent several minutes examining them before planting. As they worked together, getting soil under their fingernails and water on their clothes, realized this was the most relaxed he had felt in years. There were no urgent deadlines, no important phone calls, no complex problems to solve. Just the simple pleasure of working alongside his daughters and watching them take pride in their small accomplishments. "The seeds won't grow right away," Grace told the girls. "We need to water them every day and give them sunshine and be patient. But if we take good care of them, in a few weeks we'll see tiny green shoots." "Like baby plants," Sophie exclaimed. "Exactly like baby plants. And then the baby plants will grow bigger and stronger until they become beautiful flowers." Found himself thinking about the metaphor. His daughters were like those seeds full of potential that needed patience, care, and the right conditions to flourish. For too long, he had been focused on forcing quick growth instead of providing steady, loving care. That evening, as Grace prepared to leave for the day, found himself reluctant to see her go. The house felt different when she was there, warmer, more peaceful, more like a real home than the sterile mansion he had created. "Grace," he said as she gathered her things, "would you have dinner with us tonight? I know it's beyond your usual hours, but I'd like you to stay." Grace looked surprised. "I don't want to impose on your family time." "You're not imposing. You're part of what makes this feel like family time." Something passed across Grace's face, pleasure perhaps, but also something more complicated. "I'd like that," she said finally. Dinner was a revelation. With Grace there to facilitate conversation and help the girls engage, the meal became an actual family gathering instead of the usual quiet struggle to get through the necessary routine of eating. The girls chattered about their day, asked questions about his work, and even attempted to include him in their jokes and games. "Daddy, what's your favorite flower?" Sophie asked during dessert. Thought for a moment. "I'm not sure I have one. What do you think my favorite should be?" Sophie considered this seriously. "Maybe sunflowers like Emma's, because they're tall and strong like you, or maybe forget-me-nots because you don't want to forget us when you're at work." The innocent observation stung because it was so accurate. How often had he forgotten about his daughter's needs while he was absorbed in business matters? "I think forget-me-nots are perfect," he said. "I never want to forget how special you all are." After dinner, Grace helped with the bedtime routine, but this time participated instead of disappearing into his study. He read part of the bedtime story, helped Emma arrange her blankets in the precise way she preferred, and even attempted to braid Sophie's hair for the morning. "You're getting better at this," Grace observed as they upped the girls' rooms. "I have a good teacher," replied, and realized he meant it in more ways than one. Grace wasn't just teaching him about his daughters, she was teaching him about patience, attention, presence, and love. As they walked downstairs together, felt compelled to share something that had been weighing on his mind. "Grace, I need you to know how grateful I am for what you've done for my family. In just a few weeks, you've changed everything." Grace paused at the bottom of the stairs. "You've changed too, Mr. Wellington. The man who spends his mornings doing math games with Emma and plants seeds with Lily isn't the same man who used to leave for work before his daughters were awake." Felt exposed by her observation, but also oddly proud. "I'm trying to be better. I want to be the father they deserve." "You're already becoming that person," Grace said softly. "And that's going to matter more than any therapy or intervention ever could." They stood in the foyer and felt the weight of all the things he wanted to say but couldn't quite find words for. How did he explain that Grace had awakened something in him that he thought had died with his wife? How did he tell her that she had not only changed his daughters' lives, but had shown him who he could become as a person? "Grace," he began, then stopped, unsure how to continue. She waited patiently, the same way she waited for his daughters to find their words. "I know you need to pursue your education. I know this job is temporary for you. But I want you to know that the impact you've had on our family will last long after you leave." Grace smiled but caught that same flicker of sadness he had seen before. "Thank you. That means more to me than you know." After she left, sat in his study, but instead of opening his laptop, he found himself thinking about the day. Every moment had been fuller, richer, more meaningful than the business achievements that usually filled his time. Playing with numbers alongside Emma, learning about flowers with Sophie, sharing silent communication with Lily, these experiences felt more valuable than any deal he had ever closed. His phone buzzed with a text message from his business partner. "Missed you at the meeting today. Everything okay?" Stared at the message for a long time before responding. "Everything is better than okay." The next few days fell into a new rhythm. Rearranged his schedule to be present for the morning routine, math time, garden activities, and bedtime. He found himself looking forward to these moments more than any business meeting. He began to notice things about his daughters that had been invisible to him before. Emma's mathematical thinking was truly gifted. She could see patterns and relationships that impressed even. Sophie had an artistic eye and emotional intelligence that allowed her to read people and situations with remarkable accuracy. And Lily, despite her silence, was constantly observing and learning, storing up knowledge that she expressed through gestures and play. But he also began to notice things about Grace that went beyond her professional skills. The way she hummed unconsciously when she was content. How she always remembered small details about each girl's preferences and moods. The way her whole face lit up when one of his daughters achieved something new. The gentleness in her voice when she spoke to them, but also the respect. She never talked down to them or treated them as less capable than other children. One afternoon, while the girls were having quiet time, found Grace sitting in the garden, grading what appeared to be coursework. "Preparation for your master's program?" he asked, settling onto the bench beside her. Grace nodded. "Prerequisite courses I'm finishing up, child psychology and special education law." Glanced at her textbooks, noting the complexity of the material. "You're serious about becoming a teacher?" "It's all I've ever wanted to do," Grace said, closing her notebook. "When I was taking care of David, I realized how many children like him didn't have families who could advocate for them or understand their needs. The system fails so many kids with autism and other disabilities." "You could make more money in private therapy or consulting," pointed out. Grace smiled. "Money isn't everything, Mr. Wellington. David taught me that the most important things in life can't be bought: understanding, acceptance, love, connection. Those are what children really need." Felt challenged by her perspective. His entire adult life had been built on the assumption that money could solve any problem, provide any solution. But Grace was suggesting that the most valuable things were free, and that true success couldn't be measured in dollars. "Do you ever regret giving up other opportunities to care for your brother?" he asked. Grace was quiet for a moment, watching Emma through the window as she arranged blocks in precise patterns. "I gave up a scholarship to a prestigious university to stay home with David," she said finally. "My friends thought I was crazy. They said I was sacrificing my future for someone who would never be able to appreciate it." "But you don't regret it?" "Never. Taking care of David taught me things no university course could have. It showed me my purpose. And David, he's one of the most interesting, funny, creative people I know. My friends were wrong. He appreciates everything, just in his own way." Found himself thinking about sacrifice and purpose. He had built his wealth by focusing single-mindedly on success, often at the expense of relationships and personal fulfillment. But Grace had found her purpose through service and love, and she seemed happier and more fulfilled than most wealthy people he knew. "What about your own dreams?" asked. "Your own life outside of caring for others?" Grace turned to look at him and was struck again by the directness of her gaze. "This is my life, Mr. Wellington. Teaching children, helping them discover their strengths, supporting families, that's not a sacrifice for me. That's exactly where I want to be." That evening, as helped his daughters get ready for bed, he found himself reflecting on Grace's words. She had found her purpose in service to others, and it had brought her obvious fulfillment. Meanwhile, he had achieved everything he thought he wanted: wealth, success, respect. But until recently, he had felt empty and disconnected from his own life. The change in his relationship with his daughters was dramatic, but realized that Grace was changing him in ways that went far beyond parenting. She was showing him what it meant to be present, to pay attention, to find meaning in simple moments of connection and care. As he tucked Emma into bed, she looked up at him with serious eyes. "Daddy, are you going to keep doing math time with us after Miss Grace goes to school?" The question hit like a physical blow. In his focus on treasuring the time they had with Grace, he had avoided thinking seriously about what would happen when she left. "Of course, sweetheart," he said, hoping his voice sounded more confident than he felt. "We'll keep doing math time and garden time and story time, all of it." Emma smiled and snuggled into her pillow. "Good, I like it when you're here, Daddy." As turned off her light and closed her door, he realized that he had made a promise he wasn't sure he knew how to keep. Grace had created this peaceful, nurturing environment, but could he maintain it without her guidance? Could he continue to be the present, patient father his daughters needed? For the first time since Grace's arrival, allowed himself to think seriously about the future. In 6 weeks, she would be gone. His daughters would lose this constant source of understanding and support. And he weeks into what now thought of as the Grace effect. Something unexpected happened. He fell in love not just with the transformed atmosphere of his home, not just with this new version of himself as a father, but with Grace herself. The realization hit him during what should have been an ordinary moment. Grace was sitting cross-legged on the sunroom floor, helping Lily with a puzzle while humming softly. Sunlight streamed through the windows, catching the gold highlights in her natural hair, and when she looked up to smile at something Emma said, felt his breath catch in his throat. It wasn't just her beauty, though she was beautiful in a way that seemed to radiate from within. It was the way she saw his daughters, not as problems to be solved or burdens to be managed, but as unique individuals worthy of love and respect. It was her gentleness combined with strength, her wisdom that seemed far beyond her years, her ability to find joy in simple moments that others might overlook. The feeling terrified him. Had been married to Diana for 8 years before she died, and he had loved her deeply. But that love had been built slowly over time, based on shared goals and compatible personalities. This feeling for Grace was different, immediate, overwhelming, and completely inappropriate. She was his employee. She was young enough that the age difference felt significant. She was planning to leave in 5 weeks to pursue her own dreams. And most importantly, she had never given any indication that she saw him as anything other than her employer and the father of the children she cared for. Tried to rationalize away the feelings, telling himself it was just gratitude mixed with proximity. Grace had saved his family from chaos and brought peace to his home. Of course, he would feel emotionally attached to her. But when she laughed at something Sophie said, when she patiently guided Emma through a difficult math concept, when she created one of her small daily miracles of connection and understanding, knew this was more than gratitude. He was falling in love with a woman who was going to leave, and there was nothing he could do about it. The knowledge made him of Grace's presence in ways that felt both wonderful and torturous. He found himself noticing the way she moved through his house with quiet confidence, the way she hummed while preparing activities for the girls, the way her eyes lit up when she talked about her plans for graduate school. He noticed, too, that Grace seemed to be withdrawing slightly as her departure date approached. She was still wonderful with the girls, still patient and creative and loving, but caught moments when she looked sad, times when she seemed to be memorizing details as if she were already missing them. One evening, after an especially good day in which Emma had counted to 200, and Sophie had created a beautiful painting of their garden, found Grace sitting alone on the back patio, looking out at the sunset. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, settling into the chair beside her. Grace smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Just thinking about how much I'm going to miss this." "Miss what specifically?" "All of it, the girls, obviously, watching Emma discover new mathematical concepts, seeing Sophie's artistic abilities develop, witnessing Lily's communication skills emerge." Grace paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "I'll miss seeing them grow and change. I'll miss being part of their daily lives." Wanted to ask if she would miss him too, but he didn't dare. Instead, he said, "They're going to miss you terribly. We all are." Grace turned to look at him and caught something in her expression he couldn't quite interpret. "It's going to be hard to leave," she admitted quietly. "Then don't." The words were out before could stop them. Grace's eyes widened in surprise. "I'm sorry," said quickly. "I didn't mean to. I know you have plans, goals, I just meant." "What did you mean?" Grace asked softly. Felt himself at a crossroads. He could retreat, make a safe comment about missing her professional skills, or he could risk everything by telling the truth. I meant that these weeks with you have been the happiest I've seen my daughters since their mother died, he said carefully. And the happiest I've been as their father, maybe ever. Grace was quiet for a long moment, watching the last rays of sunlight fade behind the trees. She said, and the sound of his first name on her lips sent warmth through his chest. I need you to know that working with your family has been one of the most fulfilling experiences of my life. Your daughters are extraordinary, and watching you discover that about them has been beautiful. But there was a but coming, could hear it in her tone. But I have to pursue my education. I've worked for years to get this opportunity. And you don't really know me. You know the person I am with your children, but that's not the whole picture. Turned in his chair to face her more fully. Then tell me the whole picture, help me know all of you. Grace looked uncertain, as if she were weighing whether to share something important. My father left when David was diagnosed with autism, she said finally. He couldn't handle having a son who was different, who needed more attention and patience than typical children. He said he hadn't signed up for a damaged child. Felt anger flare on behalf of Grace and her brother. He was wrong. Maybe, but his leaving nearly destroyed my mother. She worked herself to exhaustion trying to provide for us and give David the support he needed. And I promised myself I would never depend on someone else for my security or my dreams. I would build my own life, make my own way. Independence is important, agreed, but so is partnership, connection, love. The word hung between them, more loaded with meaning than had intended. Grace stood up abruptly, wrapping her arms around herself. I should go, it's getting late. Stood too, feeling like he had pushed too hard, too fast. Grace, I'm sorry if I made you uncomfortable. She paused at the patio door, looking back at him. You didn't make me uncomfortable, that's the problem. After she left, sat alone on the patio for a long time, replaying their conversation and trying to understand what Grace had meant. Was she saying that she felt something too? Or was she warning him not to complicate their remaining time together? The next morning brought an unexpected challenge. Emma woke up with a fever and was clearly not feeling well. Called his office to cancel his meetings, but Grace assured him she could handle the situation. Sick days are part of caring for children, she said gently. Emma just needs rest and comfort. The other girls can have a quiet day too. Watched as Grace transformed the sunroom into a cozy recovery space for Emma. She dimmed the lights, brought soft blankets and pillows, and set up quiet activities that wouldn't overtax a sick child. Sophie and Lily understood that their sister needed extra care, and Grace guided them in making, get well, cards and choosing books to read quietly nearby. Throughout the day, Grace monitored Emma's temperature, encouraged her to drink fluids, and provided the kind of attentive, loving care that remembered receiving from his own mother when he was sick as a child. How did you know exactly what to do? Asked as Grace prepared a simple soup for Emma's lunch. Practice, Grace said simply. David was sick a lot when he was younger. His immune system was compromised by stress and anxiety. I learned that sick children need comfort and security even more than medicine. As the day progressed, found himself observing Grace with new eyes. Her competence in caring for a sick child, her ability to keep the other girls calm and occupied, her instinctive understanding of what Emma needed, it all spoke to a depth of experience and wisdom that went far beyond her years. By evening, Emma was feeling better, but she was clingy and wanted extra attention. Grace sat with her on the couch, reading stories and letting Emma rest against her shoulder. Miss Grace, Emma said sleepily, when you go to school, will you forget about us? Grace's arms tightened around Emma. Oh, sweetheart, I could never forget about you. You and your sisters are going to be in my heart forever. But we won't see you anymore, Emma said, and heard the sadness in his daughter's voice. No, we probably won't see each other very often, Grace admitted. But that doesn't mean I love you any less. Love doesn't disappear when people aren't together. Sophie, who had been coloring nearby, looked up. Like how we still love Mommy even though she's in heaven. Grace nodded. Exactly like that. Love stays in your heart even when people can't be with you. Felt his throat tighten as he watched this conversation. His daughters were going to lose Grace in just a few weeks, and they were already beginning to grieve that loss. How was he going to help them through it? How was he going to get through it himself? That night, after the girls were asleep, found Grace in the kitchen, cleaning up the day's dishes. You were wonderful with Emma today, he said. I don't think I could have managed her illness as well as you did." Grace smiled tiredly. "You would have figured it out. Parenting is mostly about being present and responding to what your children need in the moment." "Is that what you learned from taking care of David?" Grace nodded, drying a plate with careful attention. "David taught me that love is about showing up consistently, even when it's difficult, especially when it's difficult." Moved closer, taking the dish towel from her hands. "Grace, can I ask you something personal?" She looked up at him, wariness flickering in her eyes. "Okay. Have you ever been in love? Romantically, I mean." Grace was quiet for so long that thought she might not answer. "Once," she said finally. "In college. His name was Michael. We dated for 2 years, and I thought we would get married after graduation." "What happened?" Grace's expression became guarded. "He met David during a family dinner. David was having a difficult day. He was overstimulated and anxious, and he had a meltdown at the restaurant. Michael was embarrassed. He said he couldn't handle being part of a family with that kind of problem." Felt fury rise in his chest. He was an idiot. "Maybe, but it taught me something important about choosing the people I let into my life. Anyone who can't accept and love David isn't someone I want to be with." Understood, then, why Grace had been so cautious about getting too close to him. She had been hurt by someone who couldn't accept the complexity of her family, and she was protecting herself from experiencing that pain again. "Grace," said carefully, "I want you to know that what I've seen you do with David, with my daughters, it doesn't make me think less of you. It makes me admire you more than I can express." Grace looked up at him and saw tears shining in her eyes. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I think you should know that not everyone is like Michael. Some of us can see the beauty in what you do, the strength it takes to love someone unconditionally." Grace stepped closer to him and felt the air between them change. "I know you're leaving," said softly. "I know you have plans and dreams that don't include staying here, but I needed you to know that these weeks with you have changed everything for me, not just as a father, but as a man." Grace reached up and touched his face gently, and felt like he might stop breathing. "You've changed too," she whispered. "The man I met 6 weeks ago was so focused on providing for his daughters that he forgot to actually be with them. But the man standing here now, you've learned to see them, to love them exactly as they are. That transformation has been beautiful to witness." Covered her hand with his own, holding it against his cheek. "Grace, I'm falling in love with you." The words hung between them, honest and vulnerable and terrifying. Grace's eyes filled with tears. "I can't." "You can't what?" "I can't let myself feel this. I can't stay, and I can't start something that has no future." But even as she said the words, Grace didn't pull away from him. They stood in the quiet kitchen, her hand warm against his face, both of them breathing carefully. "What if it did have a future?" asked quietly. "What if there were possibilities neither of us has considered?" Grace finally stepped back, wrapping her arms around herself in that protective gesture was beginning to recognize. "I have 4 more weeks here," she said. 4 weeks before I start a new chapter of my life that I've been working toward for years. Can we focus on that? On making these last weeks good for the girls?" Wanted to argue, wanted to find a way to convince her to stay, or at least to consider staying. But he could see the conflict in her eyes, the way she was torn between what she felt and what she thought she needed to do. "Of course," he said finally, "the girls are what matter most." But as Grace said goodnight and headed toward her room, knew that the conversation was far from over. He was in love with her, and if he wasn't completely wrong about what he had seen in her eyes, she was developing feelings for him too. The question was whether 4 weeks would be enough time to show her that some opportunities were worth changing plans for, and that some kinds of love were worth the risk of depending on another person. Had built his fortune by recognizing valuable opportunities and acting on them decisively. But this wasn't a business deal. This was about love, family, and helping someone he cared about see that her dreams and the final 4 weeks of Grace's time with the Wellington family passed like a dream and a nightmare combined. Every day brought moments of perfect joy, Emma mastering multiplication tables while sitting in his lap, Sophie creating artwork that revealed her growing confidence, Lily finally saying her first clear word, Grace, of course. But underneath it all was the constant awareness that time was running out. Threw himself into learning everything he could from Grace about caring for his daughters. He took notes during their daily routines, asked endless questions about their individual needs, and practiced the patience and presence that came so naturally to Grace. "You don't have to try so hard," Grace said one afternoon as they watched the girls play in the garden. "You're already a good father. You just needed to learn how to see your children clearly." "I'm terrified of failing them after you leave," admitted. "What if I can't maintain what you've built here? What if they regress without you?" Grace turned to face him, her expression serious. "The most important thing I've done here isn't any specific technique or activity. It's showing your daughters that they are loved and accepted exactly as they are. As long as you remember that, as long as you keep seeing their gifts instead of focusing on their challenges, they'll continue to thrive." But Spheres went deeper than parenting techniques. In the weeks since he had confessed his feelings, the emotional tension between him and Grace had become almost unbearable. She maintained her professional demeanor during the day, but caught her looking at him with expressions he couldn't quite interpret. Sometimes she seemed sad, sometimes conflicted, and occasionally, though he might have been imagining it, he thought he saw longing. 2 weeks before Grace's scheduled departure, made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of going to the office, he spent the morning researching universities with special education programs. By afternoon, he had a plan. He found Grace reading to the girls in the sunroom, all three of them snuggled around her like she was the center of their universe. "Grace, could I speak with you privately when you have a moment?" After the girls were settled with quiet activities, Grace joined in his study. She looked nervous and realized she probably thought he was going to make their remaining time more difficult by pressing her about their relationship. "I have a proposition for you," said, indicating the chair across from his desk. "A business proposition." Grace raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "I'm listening." Had prepared for this conversation, but now that the moment was here, he felt uncharacteristically nervous. "I've been researching graduate programs in special education. UCLA has an excellent program that would allow you to specialize in autism spectrum disorders." "UCLA is very competitive," Grace said carefully. "I was fortunate to be accepted at the state school." "UCLA is also 30 minutes from here," continued, "which means you could pursue your master's degree while continuing to work with my daughters part-time." Grace stared at him. "I can't afford UCLA, and I've already committed to the state program." "What if tuition wasn't an issue?" asked. "What if I offered to pay for your education in exchange for your commitment to work with their future together didn't have to be mutually exclusive?" He just had to figure out how to convince Grace of that before time ran out loose. What exactly? Sat in his study that night, staring out the window at the garden where they had planted seeds together. Grace had become more than just his daughter's caregiver. She had become their guide to a different way of living, a different understanding of what mattered most in life. But she was leaving, and had no idea how to preserve what she had built or how to continue growing into the man and father she had inspired him to become. Built, or how to continue being the father his daughters needed without her guidance. The weight of that approaching loss settled over him like a cloud, even as he watched his daughters experience pure joy in the moment. For the first time since his wife's death, had glimpsed what happiness looked like for his family. And now he was going to lose ITAY, realized he didn't want this peaceful day to end. He wanted to understand how to maintain this atmosphere, how to be the kind of father his daughters deserved. But first, he needed to learn more about the remarkable young woman who was showing him a completely different way of seeing his children and his world.